My cat dragged home a tiny bobcat cub, a rescue story that shocked everyone. The summer heat arrived in Silver Hollow like a slow suffocation. Day after day, the sun hammered down on the valley with a relentless fury that seemed to have no memory of mercy. The streams that had run clear and cold through the forest for as long as anyone could remember shrank to muddy trickles, then vanished altogether, leaving behind only cracked earth and the ghosts of water. The trees stood brittle and brown, their leaves curling inward as if trying to hold on to whatever moisture remained in their veins. Even the birds fell silent, too exhausted by the heat to sing. Noah Hartwell sat on the porch of his cabin, a glass of lukewarm water in his weathered hands, watching the forest die inch by inch. He was 73 years old, and he had seen droughts before, but nothing like this, nothing that felt so much like an ending. The cabin behind him, built by his grandfather nearly a century ago, creaked in the heat as if it too were suffering. Inside, the rooms were thick with dust and silence, the kind of silence that comes when there is no one left to fill the spaces with conversation or laughter. For nearly 20 years, Butter had been his companion. The old tortoiseshell cat had appeared on his doorstep one rainy autumn evening when she was barely more than a kitten, bedraggled and mewing pitifully. Allie had scooped her up immediately, declaring that the little creature looked like melted butter, all golden and cream swirled together. The name had stuck. Butter had seen them through good years and bad, through the slow decline of Allie's health and her death 3 winters ago, through the bitter argument with Anna that had driven his daughter away 6 years past. But now Butter was gone too. She had disappeared over a month ago, slipping out into the pre-dawn darkness one morning and simply never returning. Noah had searched for her every day at first, walking the forest paths and calling her name until his voice grew hoarse. He left food on the porch, hoping she would smell it and come home. But as the days stretched into weeks, hope began to feel like just another kind of foolishness. Noah sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of him and a pen in his hand. The words came slowly, each one feeling like a confession he had no right to make. "Dear Anna," he wrote, then stopped. What could he possibly say that would matter now? That Butter had disappeared and he was alone, that he had been wrong about Marcus, about her choices, about everything, that the cabin felt like a mausoleum, and he could barely remember what it felt like to hope for anything. He wrote about Butter instead, about how the old cat had been his last connection to the life they had all shared before everything fell apart, about how the loneliness sat in his chest like a stone, about the regret that kept him awake at night, remembering the words he had hurled at Anna when she told him she was pregnant, when she said she was going to marry Marcus despite his objections. He had said terrible things, unforgivable things, and she had left Silver Hollow with tears streaming down her face and never looked back. The soft creak of the door made him look up sharply. For a moment, he thought he had imagined it, a trick of the heat or his desperate mind. But then he saw her. Butter stood in the doorway, and Noah's heart seized in his chest. She looked like a ghost of herself, her once lustrous fur now patchy and dull, hanging loose on a frame that had thinned to almost nothing. She moved slowly, each step clearly an effort, dragging herself across the threshold as if it took every last ounce of strength she possessed. And in her mouth, held as gently as a mother cat carries her kittens, was something that made Noah's breath stop entirely. It was a bobcat cub, impossibly small, its tawny fur matted and dry, its body limp and still. For a terrible moment, Noah thought it was dead, but then he saw the faint rise and fall of its rib cage, the barely perceptible twitch of one tiny paw. Noah pushed back from the table so quickly that his chair clattered to the floor. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside Butter. His hands trembled as he reached out, then hesitated, afraid to touch either of them. Butter's eyes met his, and in that gaze he saw exhaustion, pleading, and something else, something that looked almost like trust. She laid the cub down gently on the worn floorboards, then collapsed beside it, her sides heaving with the effort of breathing. Noah gathered them both in his arms, marveling at how light they were, how fragile. He carried them to the old wicker basket in the corner of the living room, the one that had been Butter's bed for 2 decades. He lined it with soft blankets, his movements careful and deliberate, trying not to think about what it meant that Butter had used the last of her strength to bring this dying creature to him. The cub was in bad shape. Its breathing was shallow and rapid, its body radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Dehydration had shrunk its skin tight against its bones, and when Noah carefully opened its mouth, the gums were pale and dry. But what struck him most was how young it was. This was a baby, probably no more than a few weeks old, torn from its mother by some tragedy he could only imagine. Butter, despite her own exhaustion, would not rest. She curled her body around the cub and began to lick its fur with slow, methodical strokes. The gesture was so tender, so instinctively maternal, that Noah felt his throat tighten. This was what Butter had been doing for the past month. Not lost, not wandering, but out in the merciless forest, finding this abandoned creature and trying to keep it alive. Noah hurried to the kitchen and put a pot of water on to boil. While he waited, he found a clean eyedropper in the bathroom cabinet and a bottle that Allie had used to feed an injured squirrel years ago. He let the water cool until it was just warm, then carried it back to the living room and knelt beside the basket. The cub barely responded when he lifted its head. He squeezed a few drops of water onto its tongue and watched anxiously as it swallowed reflexively. A few more drops, then a few more, working slowly and patiently, stopping whenever the tiny creature seemed overwhelmed. Butter watched him with half-closed eyes, her purr a faint rumble that sounded like approval. By the time night fell, Noah had managed to get nearly half a cup of water into the cub, one painstaking drop at a time. He heated a bit of goat milk he kept in the refrigerator and added water to thin it, offering that as well. The cub took some of it, not much, but enough to give him a flicker of hope. He sat on the floor beside the basket, his back against the couch, watching the rise and fall of two sets of breathing in the lamplight. The unfinished letter to Anna still lay on the kitchen table. Forgotten. He would call the cub Aire, he decided. It was a name Allie had loved, from an old song she used to sing, air for breath, for the wind, for the invisible thing that kept all living creatures tethered to the world. For 3 days, Noah barely slept. He set an alarm to wake himself every 2 hours through the night so he could feed Aire, so he could check that she was still breathing. During the day, he sat beside the basket, watching Butter groom the cub with a devotion that seemed to be costing her what little strength she had left. The old cat ate only when Noah physically placed food in front of her arm. And even then, she took just a few bites before returning to Aire's side. On the fourth morning, Noah woke to find Aire's eyes open. They were cloudy and unfocused, but they were open, and when he picked her up, she made a sound, a tiny mewl that was barely audible but filled him with a fierce, unexpected joy. He carried her to the kitchen and tried the bottle again. This time, Aire latched on and drank eagerly, her small paws kneading against his hand. When she finished, she looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw real awareness in those eyes. She was going to live. Somehow, against all odds, this fragile creature was going to survive. But Butter was fading. Noah could see it in the way she moved, in the dullness of her coat, in how she seemed to be withdrawing into herself. She was giving everything she had to Aire, pouring her life force into keeping the cub warm and clean and comforted. It was the most selfless thing Noah had ever witnessed, and it was breaking his heart. He found himself torn between emotions he could barely name. Gratitude that Aire was recovering, that this small life would not be extinguished. Sorrow that Butter, his companion of 2 decades, was sacrificing herself for a creature she had known for only weeks. Fear that he would lose her, that he would be left alone again in this quiet cabin with only memories and regret for company. And underneath it all, a growing sense of purpose, a feeling he had not experienced since Allie died. One afternoon, while Aire slept and Butter dozed beside her, Noah wandered into the small workshop attached to the back of the cabin. He had not been in here for years, not since Allie's death had stolen his desire to create anything. Dust covered everything, the workbench, the tools hanging on the walls, the half-finished projects he had abandoned when grief made his hands too heavy to hold a chisel or a saw. He stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the space where he had spent so many happy hours. Allie used to bring him coffee while he worked, sitting on the old stool in the corner and talking about her day, about Anna's latest achievements, about the garden or the weather or nothing at all. The workshop had been a place of joy once, a place where he could lose himself in the simple pleasure of shaping wood into something beautiful and useful. Now it was just another room full of ghosts. But as Noah turned to leave, his eye caught on a scrap of pine lying on the workbench, and an idea flickered to life in his mind. Air was getting stronger, but she still struggled to move. Her legs were weak, her coordination poor. What if he could make something to help her? Something to encourage her to play, to exercise, to build the strength she would need to truly recover before he could talk himself out of it. Noah crossed to the workbench and picked up the piece of pine. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the grain, testing the weight. Then he reached for a knife. The first toy was a simple ball, carved from a single piece of wood and sanded until it was smooth as silk. It took him 2 days to make, working in short bursts between feeding Airy and caring for Butter. His hands were stiff and clumsy at first, unused to the work, but slowly the old skills returned. The knife began to move with confidence again, shaving away thin curls of wood, revealing the shape hidden inside one. When it was finished, Noah rolled the ball across the living room floor toward the basket. Air, who was awake and alert, watched it with curious eyes. The ball came to rest against her paw, and she flinched, startled. Then, tentatively, she touched it with one tiny paw. The ball rolled a few inches, and Ira's eyes widened with surprise and delight. Butter, lying beside her, lifted her tail and tapped it gently against Air's back. A gesture that seemed to say, "Well done, little one, well done." Noah felt something shift inside his chest, some frozen part of himself beginning to thaw. He went back to the workshop and started on the next project. Over the following weeks, the workshop came back to life. Noah made a bone-shaped chew toy that Air could grip in her mouth and carry around the cabin. He made a small climbing bar, angled so that Air could practice pulling herself up with her front legs. He made a puzzle box with a sliding panel that Ari had to push to reveal a treat hidden inside. Each project was a meditation, a way of channeling his worry and hope into something tangible, something that might make a difference. And it did make a difference. Ari grew stronger with each passing day. She learned to walk without stumbling, to run in short bursts across the cabin floor, to jump up onto the couch and then down again. She played with the wooden toys for hours, batting the ball from room to room, gnawing on the bone until it was covered in tiny teeth marks, climbing the bar over and over until Noah worried she would exhaust herself. But even as Ari thrived, Butter continued to weaken. She ate less and less, slept more and more. There were days when she barely lifted her head from the basket, when her breathing sounded labored and painful. Noah did everything he could think of. He tempted her with her favorite foods, chicken broth and bits of tuna. He carried her to the sunny spot by the window where she used to love to nap. He stroked her fur and whispered promises he knew he could not keep, that everything would be all right, that she would get better, that she would be here for years to come. But Butter's eyes told a different story. They were peaceful, accepting, as if she had made her choice and was content with it. She had found Air, brought her home, and ensured her survival. That was enough. One night, Noah lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the cabin settling around him. He thought about Butter, about Air, about the impossible choice the old cat had made. He thought about Anna, about the grandchild he had never met, about all the years he had wasted in stubborn pride and anger. He thought about Allie, about how she would have handled all of this with grace and wisdom, about how much he missed her guidance. And then he dreamed. In the dream, Allie sat on the porch of the cabin, her hair catching the sunlight the way it used to. Beside her, Aire sat as well, but she was fully grown, sleek and powerful and beautiful. Allie did not speak. She simply looked at Noah with those warm, knowing eyes and smiled. It was a smile that forgave everything, that understood everything, that promised that love endured even when the beloved were gone. Noah woke with tears on his face and a clarity he had not felt in years. He got out of bed, went to the closet, and dug until he found the old cassette recorder he and Allie had used to record Anna's first words, her first songs, the milestones of her childhood. He dusted it off, checked that it still worked, and carried it to the kitchen table. Then he pressed record and began to speak. He spoke about Butter and Airy, about the miracle of their bond and the heartbreak of watching one life give itself for another. He spoke about the wooden toys he had made, about how creating them had brought him back to himself. He spoke about loneliness and regret, about the things he wished he had said to Anna when he had the chance, about how sorry he was for driving her away. He spoke about Allie, about how much he missed her, about how he saw her wisdom and kindness reflected in the way Butter cared for Airy. The recordings became a habit. Every few days, Noah would sit at the kitchen table and talk to the recorder, documenting the small triumphs and setbacks of Air's recovery, the quiet moments with Butter, his own halting journey back toward something that felt like healing. He did not send the tapes to Anna. He was not even sure where she was living now. But he kept them in a box in the closet, and he allowed himself to hope that someday, somehow, she would listen to them and understand. As spring turned to summer, Airy grew from a fragile cub into a young bobcat, lean and strong and full of fierce energy. She followed Butter everywhere, mimicking her movements, learning from her in ways that seemed almost mystical. Butter taught her to avoid loud noises, to move silently through the cabin, to sit by the window and watch the forest for hours without moving. When it rained, Airy would press her face against the glass, transfixed by the water streaming down, and Butter would sit beside her, occasionally licking the younger animal's ears as if to say, "Yes, this is how we appreciate the world." And something unexpected began to happen. Butter, perhaps sensing that her work was not yet complete, seemed to stabilize. She began eating more regularly. Her coat regained some of its old luster. Her eyes brightened. She was still old, still frail, but the rapid decline had stopped. It was as if having Air to care for had given her a reason to stay. Noah watched the two of them with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. On rainy nights, when thunder rolled across the valley and lightning split the sky, Airy would press herself against Butter's side. Trembling, the old cat would wrap herself around the young bobcat and lick her face gently, over and over, until Airy's breathing calmed and she fell asleep. Noah remembered how Allie used to comfort him the same way when he was troubled, stroking his hair and murmuring soft words until the anxiety loosened its grip. The memory did not hurt the way it used to. It felt like a gift now, a reminder that love leaves echoes that persist long after the beloved are gone. One morning in early June, Noah needed to drive into town for supplies. He had been putting it off, reluctant to leave Airy and Butter alone for even a few hours. But the pantry was nearly bare and he had no choice. He made sure the animals had plenty of water and food, checked that all the windows were secure, and then reluctantly headed out to his truck. When he returned 3 hours later, his arms full of grocery bags, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Airy sat in front of the cabin door, her posture upright and alert, her golden eyes fixed on the trail that led from the main road. She did not move when Noah appeared, did not run to greet him. She simply sat there, watching him approach with an intensity that was somehow both wild and deeply familiar. When Noah reached the porch steps, Air stood. She did not rub against his legs or make a sound. She just stood there, solid and present, as if her very existence was a form of welcome. Noah felt something shift in his understanding. Air was not a pet. She was not tame, would never be tame. But in her own way, on her own terms, she had chosen to recognize him as something important. A protector, perhaps, or a place of safety, or maybe, in whatever way a bobcat could understand such things, as home. From that day forward, it became Air's habit. Whenever Noah left the cabin, no matter how briefly, she would take up her post by the door and wait for his return. Butter seemed to approve, often sitting beside her in the sunshine. The two of them like sentinels guarding something precious. But as Airy grew stronger and more confident, another change began to emerge. One evening, Noah heard a commotion outside and rushed to the window to see Airy facing down a pair of foxes that had ventured too close to the cabin. Her ears were flat against her head, her body low and coiled, a growl rumbling from her chest that raised the hair on the back of Noah's neck. The foxes, clearly sensing they had made a mistake, turned and fled into the forest. After that, it happened again and again. A weasel got too close to the porch and Ira chased it away. A raccoon tried to steal food from Butter's bowl, and Air drove it off with a ferocity that was startling to witness. She had become Butter's protector, guarding the old cat who had saved her with the same fierce devotion Butter had shown in bringing her home. The role reversal moved Noah deeply. Air had been saved, and now she was the one doing the saving. It was a kind of repayment, but also something more profound. It was a recognition that love creates obligations, that to be cared for is to learn how to care, that the circle of protection and devotion can flow in more than one direction. One afternoon in late July, Sheriff Elaine Mercer's patrol car pulled up beside Noah as he walked home from the general store. She rolled down the window and smiled, but there was something careful in her expression that put Noah on edge. "Need a ride, Noah?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. He climbed into the passenger seat, setting his grocery bag on the floor between his feet. Elaine pulled back onto the road, driving slowly, not quite meeting his eyes. "I've been hearing some talk," she said finally, "about you and a bobcat." Noah said nothing, just looked out the window at the forest passing by. "You know I have to ask," Elaine continued. "Wildlife protection laws are pretty clear. You can't keep wild animals, Noah, not even if you saved its life. There are sanctuaries, places that are equipped to handle this kind of situation." "I'm not keeping her," Noah said quietly. "She's not a possession. She stays because she chooses to stay." Elaine glanced at him. "And if someone reports it, if Fish and Wildlife decides to get involved, then I'll tell them the same thing I'm telling you. I won't keep her if she wants to go. She has the right to choose her home. Home isn't where we're born, it's where the heart belongs." They drove the rest of the way in silence. When Elaine pulled into Noah's driveway, Ari was waiting by the door as always, her posture upright, her eyes scanning the path. The moment she saw Noah step out of the car, her entire demeanor changed. Her eyes brightened, her tail twitched, and she stood, every line of her body expressing an emotion that looked remarkably like joy. Then she saw Elaine, and everything shifted again. The softness vanished, replaced by a wariness that bordered on aggression. Ire's ears went back, her muscles tensed, and she stared at the sheriff with unmistakable hostility. Elaine froze, one hand on the car door. She looked at Ari, then at Noah, then back at Ari. In the bobcat's eyes, there was a clarity that needed no translation. This was her person, her home, and she would defend it if necessary. After a long moment, Elaine slowly got back into her car. She met Noah's gaze through the window and nodded once, a gesture that might have been understanding or surrender or simply acceptance. Then she drove away, leaving Noah and Ari alone in the driveway. Noah climbed the porch steps and sat down on the bench. Suddenly exhausted, Ari padded over and sat beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body. He reached out and rested his hand on her head, and she allowed it, closing her eyes briefly before opening them again to resume her watch over the forest. "You're getting too good at this," Noah murmured, "defending your territory. Pretty soon you won't need me at all." But even as he said it, he knew it was not quite true. Ari did not need him in the way a domestic animal needs its owner. But there was a connection between them, forged in those desperate early days when her life hung by a thread, strengthened by the routine of care and feeding and simply being present. It was a bond that transcended the categories of wild and tame, human and animal. It was something rarer and more precious. The summer passed into autumn. The drought finally broke in mid-August with a storm that lasted 3 days and filled the streams again, bringing the forest back to life. Butter seemed to rally with the change in weather, spending her afternoons in the garden, watching butterflies and dozing in patches of sunlight. Air stayed close to her always, a silent guardian. But on a clear morning in early September, when the air smelled of wood smoke and falling leaves, something shifted. Noah woke to find Ari sitting by the open door, staring out at the forest with an expression he had never seen before. It was not quite longing, not quite sadness. It was recognition, perhaps, an acknowledgement of something calling to her from beyond the small world of the cabin. Noah got out of bed and walked to the door. Ari looked up at him, then at Butter, who still lay in her basket, watching with calm eyes. For a moment, none of them moved. Then Ari stood and took a step toward the threshold. "You're strong enough now," Noah said, his voice thick with emotion he did not try to hide. "You're ready. Thank you for staying." Ari looked at him for a long moment, and Noah could have sworn he saw something like gratitude in those golden eyes. Then she turned her gaze to Butter, who blinked slowly, a gesture that seemed to carry blessing and release. Finally, Ari looked up at the sky, at the vast expanse of blue stretching above the trees. She was saying goodbye to Allie. Noah thought, somehow, in whatever way a wild creature could understand such things, Ari knew that there had been another presence here, another thread in the web of care and love that had saved her life. Ari stepped forward and touched her nose to Noah's hand, a brief contact that felt like a promise and a farewell all at once. Then she turned and walked down the porch steps, across the yard, and into the forest. Her gait was steady and sure. No trace of the weakness that had nearly killed her. She did not look back. Butter remained at the door, watching until Ari disappeared among the trees. Then she closed her eyes and settled back into her basket, as if satisfied that her work was finally complete. Noah stood on the porch for a long time, watching the place where Ari had vanished. He felt the loss of her like a physical ache, but underneath it was something else. Pride, perhaps, or peace, or simply the understanding that some loves are not meant to be held forever, that the truest gift you can give is the freedom to choose. Months passed, autumn deepened into winter, and the first snow fell on Silver Hollow in November. Noah settled into a new routine, one that felt quieter but not quite as lonely as before. He continued making things in his workshop, not for air anymore, but for the simple pleasure of creation. He continued recording his thoughts on the old cassette player, talking to Anna as if she could hear him, hoping that somehow the words would find their way to her. And then, on a cold December morning, he heard a knock at the door. When Noah opened it, he found Anna standing on the porch, a small boy holding her hand. She looked older, tired, but her eyes held the same determination he remembered from her childhood. The boy, who could only be his grandson, stared up at him with solemn curiosity. "Dad?" Anna said, her voice wavering. "I heard about the bobcat. I heard you'd been alone. I thought maybe it was time to come home." Noah could not speak. He simply opened his arms, and Anna stepped into them. The boy pressed between them. And for the first time in 6 years, Noah felt whole. The boy was Ben, and they had been living 3 states away. Anna working 2 jobs to make ends meet, raising her son alone after Marcus had left them a year ago. She had heard about Noah and the bobcat through mutual friends in Silver Hollow, stories that had taken on the quality of local legend, the old man and the wild cat he had saved. Or perhaps that had saved him. The telling varied, but the heart of the story remained the same. They moved into the small cottage next to Noah's cabin, close enough to share meals but far enough to give everyone space. Anna and Ben spent hours listening to the cassette tapes Noah had recorded, Anna crying through some of them, laughing through others, holding her father's hand while he explained what he had been thinking, what he had hoped to say if he ever had the chance. "You did say it," Anna whispered. "You said it all, Dad. I hear you." They fell into a rhythm, the 4 of them, Noah and Anna and Ben and Butter. They planted a garden together that winter, preparing for spring. They read books under the bare branches of the maple trees, bundled in blankets against the cold. They cooked meals together, filling the cabin with warmth and conversation and the kind of ordinary happiness that Noah had thought was lost to him forever. On Noah's 74th birthday, in late February, they woke to find fresh tracks in the snow leading up to the porch. Noah recognized them immediately. He opened the door, and there was Ari, sitting on the top step as if she had never left. She was magnificent. Her coat gleamed. Her body was powerful and healthy, every inch of her radiating wild vitality. She looked at Noah, then at Ben, who stood behind his grandfather with wonder eyes. She did not approach, did not try to come inside. She simply sat there, watching them, her presence a gift in itself. They spent the day baking bread and cookies by the fireplace, Ben chattering excitedly about the bobcat on the porch, asking 100 questions about where she had been and why she had come back. Ari stayed the entire day, leaving only when night fell. melting back into the forest as silently as she had appeared. The next morning, she was gone. Noah searched for her tracks, but the snow had fallen again overnight, covering any trace of her passage. She did not return that winter, or the spring that followed, or the summer after that. But the village children, who had heard the story from their parents and grandparents, began to call the forest path that ran behind Noah's cabin the Way of the Beloved One. They said that if you walked it at dawn or dusk, you might catch a glimpse of a golden shadow moving through the trees, a wild thing that had chosen love over solitude, that had learned what it meant to belong. One evening, as Noah and Ben sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the mountains, Ben asked the question that had been troubling him for months. "Grandpa, do you think Ere will ever come back?" Noah looked out at the forest, at the path that wound into shadows and secrets, at the blunt, unknowable wildness that Ere had chosen over the safety of the cabin. "I don't know, he said honestly, "but I hope she doesn't." Ben looked up at him, confused and a little hurt. "Why?" Noah put his arm around his grandson's shoulders. "Because happiness doesn't mean staying together until the end. Sometimes happiness is walking together through the most beautiful part of the journey, and then being brave enough to let go. Ere taught me that, your grandmother taught me that too, in a different way, and now I'm teaching you." "But I miss her," Ben said, his voice small. "I miss her too." Noah agreed. "Missing someone doesn't mean we made a mistake. It means we loved well, and loving well is always worth it, even when it hurts." They sat together in the gathering darkness, grandfather and grandson, watching the forest come alive with evening sounds. Inside the cabin, Anna was making dinner, and Butter was curled in her basket by the fire, purring in her sleep. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke and the promise of autumn, somewhere in the vast forest. Aeri ran through the gathering dusk, her paws barely touching the ground, her heart full of wild joy. She had been saved, and she had saved in return. She had learned what home meant, and she had learned when to leave. She carried with her the memory of gentle hands and wooden toys and the warm weight of an old cat sleeping beside her. She carried the understanding that love is not possession, that family can be chosen, that belonging is a gift freely given and freely released. And in the old wooden cabin at the edge of Silver Hollow, 4 lives continued their quiet dance of healing and hope, bound together by threads of love and loss and the fierce, improbable grace of second chances. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.